So looking over our Doctor Doom coverage throughout the history of this channel, I realized we never covered the ending of Books of Doom, despite talking about it so much. So Books of Doom is the definitive origin story for Doctor Doom in Marvel Comics. It's the best origin story to ever exist for Doctor Doom. Not like the one that we just covered. That was actually the Ultimate Universe version of Doctor Doom. But what this one does here is this opens up seemingly telling us a couple of different things. The first is that, like Terrence Howard in his just completely unhinged interview on Joe Rogan Experience, that Doctor Doom remembers life in the womb. But it also kind of hits at the idea that this is for two different reasons. The first is largely due to his intelligence, that he was born with just something different about him that made him unique and in a lot of ways kind of above everybody else. But the second thing actually answers the first, which is that Doctor Doom had essentially been cursed ever since his birth. And this is due to the actions of his mother, Cynthia. Now, she's not a hugely explored character in this story, but she is important to the life and times of Doctor Doom. You'll get enough in this to understand her significance. But the thing about this is that Cynthia Von Doom had basically been dabbling in witchcraft. Specifically, she sold her soul to Mephisto. And as most people know, when it comes to Mephisto in Marvel, he is basically a Hell Lord, right? So when you make a deal with him, he'll cost you something. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute, because what happens is that in this environment that Doctor Doom is raised in, basically a Romani, that he's always kind of chased around by the Baron's soldiers, so much so that like they steal from them, they do terrible things to the women in their group, different things along those lines. And so Cynthia Von Doom in her anger basically channels the power of Mephisto and takes out a whole bunch of the Baron's soldiers. But the price that's paid by making a deal with Mephisto is that she's doing this to save the Romani people. Mephisto takes all the firstborn children of the Romani people themselves, right? They lose their children. It's very biblical in that sort of way. Now, Doctor Doom is spared, and there's a reason why that happens. But in the aftermath of this, right, despite the Baron's soldiers, or at least a good number of them being taken out, the fact that the entire Romani group lost their children, they look at Victor Von Doom and his father kind of strangely. So much so that they actually talk about kicking them out, right? Just sort of turning them out there into the world, and who knows what would happen to them. And this is when you really start to see the person that Doctor Doom will become. Because what he does is he threatens them. He's like, okay, look, you guys could throw us out if you want to, but understand, you pay your money and take your chances. Because if you throw us out, then I will become my mother's son. And the pain and suffering that you endured due to her actions will be nothing compared to what I will visit on you. Right? You will spend the rest of your days ruining the day that you threw us out. And so ultimately they don't. They allow them to stay. And so while they are there, it is largely, kind of hinted at that they're kind of outcast, but his father also never really talks. He never really says anything. And when they do talk, and if they do happen to talk about his mother, they never talk about what happened, right? It's always her smile or something along those lines. Now, during this time, he does meet a young girl named Valeria, and he says that he falls in love with her, but the reality is that it's probably more like puppy love. But the cool thing about Valeria is that, of course, as we know, Reed Richards' daughter is essentially named after this girl. And two, it's the closest thing that Victor's ever going to come to having some measure of a normal life. And he even says that, right? He says, when I was 11 years old, the only thing I wanted from the world was to grow up and marry her. How simple life seems to a child, even to one like me. And so what ends up happening is that once him and Valeria return to their camp, they end up discovering that his father has been called by the Baron to tend to the Baron's wife. Now, a lot of you guys who are familiar with the origin of Doctor Doom in Marvel Comics, you probably know about this. This is one that was actually basically created or established by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in the old Fantastic Four Annual #2, the original appearance of Doctor Doom in Marvel Comics. But this, of course, as with most stories like this, expands on it greatly, not immensely, and it kind of requires a little bit of understanding of what's going on. The long and short of this is that Doctor Doom's father could not cure the Baron's wife. And because of that, it was believed that Doctor Doom's father had poisoned his wife or somehow made it worse. The reality is that he didn't. He just wasn't able to take care of her. And so as a result, the Baron basically wants to take out his dad. And so his father flees, grabs Doctor Doom, and they take off into the Latvian Alps. And they're literally just trying to survive, is really all it is. And ultimately what ends up happening is that Doctor Doom's father, of course, gives Doom his coat and then puts his arms around him and then seems to freeze to death. Now he doesn't, right? He's basically recovered by the Romani tribe and then ultimately taken by the Baron's soldiers back to the Baron himself, where he would ultimately just lay and wait to be executed. But what ends up happening is that Victor Von Doom is kind of instilled with this hatred of the Baron because it's essentially cost him everything he loved and cared about. idea. More so than that, though, the driving force behind Doctor Doom is his desire to free his mother's soul from the Netherrealm. And that's one of the things to know about Doctor Doom. It's not really established in the story. I mean, it is towards the end, but it's not really stated this is why he did everything he did. But up until the story of Triumph and Torment, the goal of Doctor Doom in attaining absolute power was for the purpose of trying to free his mother's soul from Mephisto. Again, we'll talk about why once we get towards the end, but after her soul was essentially freed, right at the end of Triumph and Torment, then it was just Doctor Doom being a dick, if we're being honest with ourselves. I mean, it's just him, just power for power's sake is really all it was. But the reality here is that he ends up really kind of dabbling into the idea of merging science and magic together, which allows him to avoid the pitfalls that his mother found herself falling into, but also allows him to push magic and science in a way that nobody had ever considered before. But the first time that Doctor Doom actually kills anybody is kind of devastating to him, but even he says it basically changed him in a way that he couldn't come back from, because there comes a point when he's caught up to you, and this guy, literally this hunter, just kind of has a gun pointed at him and says, like, the Baron's reward on your head will have me and mine living in a castle. And so he intends to, like, take Doom in, right? Doom basically grabs him and then chokes this guy to death. And he says, it takes far longer to strangle a man than I had imagined. I kept my hands locked around his throat for several minutes after he stopped struggling, just to be certain. And I looked into his eyes to see if there was any change from living to death, but I saw nothing. Inside, though, I felt a cold vanish as I looked down at this poor fool. My hands began to shake, and I suddenly felt the horror of what I had done. Now, that's one of the things you're going to notice over time with this story. Bit by bit, Doctor Doom is going to become more and more extreme. Bit by bit, he's going to lose his humanity. And that's really what the suit represents, right? Just the absence of any real humanity in Victor Von Doom. And there's a really, really cool moment where he sees Valeria later on, and she really perfectly encapsulates what the suit means. But because of the fact that Doctor Doom is working on all these contraptions, right? Creating these kind of technological devices that he uses against the Baron soldiers, that sometimes encases them in ice, sometimes it uses heat. It draws the attention of the United States government, because this was at a time post-World War II when you basically had the Cold War. And there is going to be a really cool kind of involvement of Department X later on. I'll talk about what that means when we get to it. But the reality here is, while it's not really explicitly stated that it's like Weapons Plus or anything like that, it kind of seems to be the case, but it's more just government contract work. The United States government just working on all kinds of different items and artifacts and technological advancements and things like that. And so this is how Doctor Doom goes from being in Latveria to being at State University, as it's stated here, where basically he ends up meeting Reed Richards for the very first time. Now, this is where you do get a couple of changes with regards to what was established in the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stories and what you kind of know about Doctor Doom now, but just to say that he and Reed weren't really roommates in the traditional sense. And in fact, it's one of the things that's kind of hit on later on, although it's not overly important. What is important here is that Doctor Doom basically leads two lives. There is the life he leads, essentially performing all these different projects and working on these little things for the federal government and all the stuff that they want to do. But then there's his real goal, which is to find a way to access essentially the realm of Mephisto and free his mother's soul, all the while having no real idea of what he's actually getting into. But what you also get here along the way is just how intelligent he is and the big difference between himself and Reed Richards. And there's even a really strong indication here that Doctor Doom is legitimately smarter than Reed. It goes back and forth in Marvel Comics. Really, it's like Doctor Doom, Reed Richards, and then Valeria Richards, the daughter of Reed, is like the smartest person in the Marvel Universe. Again, like the three just kind of switch places depending on the story. But there's this point here where you have Doctor Doom in a theoretical science class who's talking to the professor, and kind of picking up in mid-conversation, the professor says, "No, I don't believe that's what Einstein was trying to say, Victor." And Victor says, "I'm sure it wasn't, Professor, but it is what I am not trying, but actually am saying." And he says, "I'm saying that time is not a flowing river the way it appears to us. Time exists as a constant, but most human minds are unable to perceive it in any other capacity other than the most linear. In essence, we are then time's prisoners." And when he's making this case, Reed Richards actually stands up and is like, I actually kind of have to agree with Dr. Doom, right? With, well, Victor Von Doom, as he's known here, that he's kind of right? My own experiments have already scratched the surface of other realms. So again, they're kind of doing the same thing at the same time, but for different reasons. But the other part of this is that Victor Von Doom doesn't really fit in. Like, he's foreign, he's attractive, and so a lot of women on campus are very interested in him, if for no other reason than the fact that he's just different from what they're used to. And so because of that, like, they really gun for him pretty consistently, but he has no interest in women in any real way, right? His dedication, singular-minded focus is on his project in accessing the Netherrealm and whatever it is that he does for the government. Now, the other cool thing here is when he's working for the government, technically he's creating robots for them, but he starts to work on the early prototype of what will become the Doombot. So there's all these cool little moments, these small little things that he's doing out here. But ultimately, it all comes to a head with him conducting his experiment and trying to access the Netherrealm. By this point in time, you have Reed Richards and kind of the classic scene where Reed was like in the dorm room of Dr. Doom, and Dr. Doom believed that Reed was messing with his documents and different things like that. But the bigger point is when they access the device, that Dr. Doom realizes the totality of what he's stepping into, that he is transferred to the Netherrealm, and he meets Mephisto, and he realizes two things. Number one, Mephisto is astronomically powerful, not somebody to be trifled with. In his home dimension, he is as powerful as anybody potentially can be. The other thing is how nefarious and duplicitous Mephisto is, because he has Cynthia Von Doom just chained up, right? And it's just like, I love tormenting her. Like, that's really all it is. I just love tormenting her and screwing with her psychologically. Dr. Doom actually kind of wanders around this place for a pretty lengthy period of time, despite the fact that only seemingly a few seconds pass in the real world. But ultimately, the device kind of explodes. And when it does, right, like some of his classmates are injured, Dr. Doom's face is disfigured, and he's essentially expelled from the university. And because of the fact that he just sees himself as somebody who has failed so drastically, he just kind of falls into a state of depression. He sabotages the entirety of the facility, right, that he's working for with the government, and then flees, right, takes off to Latveria. But the other part of this is that because he encountered Mephisto in the Netherrealm, he's now touched by the power of Mephisto, which means Mephisto comes and goes in his nightmares, essentially. And so he gets these kind of experiences when he's sleeping where he actually sees Mephisto in the realm of hell, and Mephisto torments him, right? He just kind of makes fun of him. You know, where are you going to go? What are you going to do, right? You know, you're going to be mine one day. Like, I'm going to destroy you, like that kind of a thing. Because having someone like Dr. Doom under his control, especially knowing what Dr. Doom will become at some point in time, is very alluring for Mephisto. And so in essence, Dr. Doom just kind of takes up residence out in Eastern Europe somewhere in just the basement of a pretty shoddy building. And he's just kind of always coming across this guy named Otto who just sits outside on the stairs outside the door, right? And like he just kind of dismisses him as a homeless guy and whatever, and just sort of goes about there. I mean, for the most part, he's laying low, right? Because he knows that like the Americans are probably still looking for him, but he also realizes that being out here in this place, it draws the attention of the Soviet Union. Specifically, a couple of guys appear out of nowhere and they say like, we know who you are. You need to come and work for us. We work for Department X. Now, the significance of Department X in Marvel Comics is that while Weapons Plus started with Captain America, right? Project Rebirth, if you follow Grant Morrison's X-Men, and then ran all the way up to like Wolverine with Weapon X and some of the stuff that came after, Department X was the Soviet Union's version of that. And there were a lot of familiar faces that came out of Department X, the Red Room Project, Black Widows, essentially, the Winter Soldier, right? Bucky Barnes, right? That was all Department X in the Soviet Union. And so Dr. Doom, knowing, or at least seemingly being aware that at this point in time, different people with superpowers, like Colossus, for example, who was almost snatched up by the Russian government, but was rescued by Xavier and ultimately joined the X-Men, knowing that kind of thing was going on, ultimately Dr. Doom just shies away from it all, right? Just tells him like, don't ever come back here, right? He literally attacks him. This is like, don't ever come back here. If I ever see you, I will kill you. In the middle of all this, he's suddenly met by what seems to be just a surprise arrival of Valeria. Now, Valeria tells the story, and what she says when the two of them meet back up is that following Dr. Doom's departure, after he had essentially become the leader of the Romani tribe, that the Baron was constantly sending his guys after the tribe and attacking them, trying to find out the location of Dr. Doom. The idea being that when Doom had basically fled the United States, that the Baron was trying to make good with the United States, and that by raiding the Romani tribe, that he could somehow find Doom and hand him back over to the US government, likely in exchange for political favors or probably money or something along those lines. And so what ends up happening happening is that one of the members of the tribe, a guy by the name of Christos, who was the quote unquote fortune teller of the Romani, had basically said that, like, Dr. Doom is here in Eastern Europe and his mind is quite broken. And, I've seen him in a vision and different things like that. And basically the tribe saves up all the money they have. They put Valeria on a train and they send her out here to where Dr. Doom is at. And of course, it does seem too good to be true, but for a moment, Dr. Doom knows happiness. And he's at this place in this life where he's actually kind of ready to leave everything behind. Because when he's in the arms of Valeria, it's the first time that he actually feels some measure of satisfaction with his life, right? That like nothing else in the world matters. But of course, as with most things that seem too good to be true, this was. Because what ends up happening is that you have Otto, who gives Valeria a flower, and that the two of them just kind of talk for a moment, and Dr. Doom is dismissive of him, and then like a car comes out of nowhere, and these soldiers, the same ones that visited Dr. Doom before, snatch up Valeria and hold her hostage and basically say, if you don't join us, we're gonna kill her. And that's when Doom realizes that Christos was basically full of crap. That what was going on is that Christos was just trying to find a way to survive. And he had learned from essentially the Baron and their guys that like Dr. Doom was in Eastern Europe. And so he fed Valeria and the tribe this story of how, oh, I saw him, in a teacup and yada, 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 and so on and so forth. They believed it and they sent her here. It was basically these guys just following Valeria in order to find Doom. And so what ends up happening is in the middle of all this, the flower creates this protective sphere. And then like a guy runs out of nowhere, basically saves Valeria and essentially stops the guards, right? Creates this, whole kind of smoke show and everything. And then you find out it was Otto. Right? And then like Otto's basically dead. But there was more to him than they're initially seen because he's the one that sets Dr. Doom on the path of finding the Tibetan monks. This is not the story of Doctor Strange and the Ancient One. Dr. Doom never comes across them. Although it would be cool if he had actually been the one to go see the Ancient One instead of Stephen Strange. But with Otto basically dying, he's the one that tells Doom, like, there is a story of a man who has basically lost everything, right? Who's a faceless man that's supposed to come to us, and he is going to basically blend science and magic and lead the world into a new era. And so ultimately, Dr. Doom leaves Valeria behind, going so far as to tell her she doesn't understand what it means to truly do something great, and that he has a vast and incredible destiny ahead of him, and just walks away, right? And like, that's literally it. And so what he does is he gives this really cool explanation where he talks about traveling through the mountains of Tibet, very much the same way that Stephen Strange did, where he's going through and looking up these old scrolls and parchments and finding these little bits of clues here and there and small little things that ultimately just don't really seem to tell him exactly where to go, until he ends up finding essentially a document from like 600 years ago that gives him the strongest possible clue he has, which is just kind of go that way. And so he does. Now he does end up coming across a Yeti, which is kind of a weird little moment in the story. Of course, Dr. Doom destroys it, as you would expect, right? Like, since when has a Yeti ever been anything that Dr. Doom would fear or be destroyed by? Although he's not really the Dr. Doom that we know yet. He's more science than magic at this point in time. So a lot of the devices that he has are devices that like keep him warm, protect him from the cold, different things like that, and allow him to defeat this Yeti and skin it and then wear its skin. Like literally just wear this thing around, which admittedly looks pretty dope, to be honest with you guys. But he's ultimately discovered by these monks, and then he's brought to their temple where he essentially spends a week resting and recovering and then emerges. And then you get this really, really cool, almost kind of montage thing where he says, and so days became weeks, and weeks faded to years without notice. Ever was I lost in my studies, and there was much to learn. For centuries, these men had been combining magic and technology almost instinctively, creating devices the outside world could only dream of until recently. As my studies wore on, I began to lean again towards science, but this time with the eyes of one who has seen that nothing is impossible, that no laws of our world are absolute. And after 5 years among these monks, the day did indeed come when they called me, and they say, Master, we have taught you all our ancient secrets, and still you grow beyond us. Your mind sees answers to questions we have yet to ask. We bow before you, O Great One. And Dr. Doom, kind of, again, talking about his own past, says, at that moment, I knew the world lay within my grasp, that whatever Von Doom wanted, it would be mine. The question was, where would I start? And he just tells them, let us prepare for a journey. And so he says, too long had I been away from the world. And while I knew that my ultimate path lay in the nether realms, I felt that other fates also awaited Victor Von Doom. So I needed to see what shape the world had gotten into since I had left it. And I needed supplies for the things I intended to create. And so as he gets out there into the world, instead of having found himself with this mindset where he gains a new appreciation for a world that he had seemingly left behind, he's actually more inhuman now than he was before. And I'm not talking about the inhuman race. Those guys are trash. But he just kind of lost his humanity, right? Like when he sees these young kids who are just asking for money, right? More rupees, he just says, get away from me, you rancid little creatures. So he doesn't really see any real relation between himself and anybody else that's out there. And so what he ends up doing is actually taking up residence. He says, the top level of the temple's inner sanctum had become my private quarters, with its tall windows looking out at the endless mountain ranges. And in this place, my servants and I built a device with which I could observe the whole world, a compound screen viewer whose receivers drew signals from radio waves, satellite feeds, television broadcasts, and nearly anything else floating out in the ether around us. Nothing was kept hidden from me. I watched simultaneous news broadcasts from around the globe. I tapped into satellite controls. I learned of how Latveria had changed, and I watched Golden Girls. The man responsible for my parents' death had now taken the throne. I felt bile rise in my throat, hatred for this man suddenly pulsing in my veins. But then I saw something else, and he actually sees a news broadcast with Reed Richards. Now, this is where things kind of get a little flimsy when it comes to Dr. Doom, because what happens is that the appearance of Reed talking about how he's working on a space mission, and obviously the events that will transpire in him and Susan, Ben, and Johnny going into space, gaining their powers and becoming the Fantastic Four, that Reed's talking about all of this, and it brings back all the memories from like basically Dr. Doom's first failure, the explosion of the chair and all that kind of stuff. And so in a lot of ways, whether rational or irrational, he draws this conclusion that Reed Richards was in his room and that Reed Richards must have messed with his notes or something along those lines, right? Screwed with his stuff. And so he just kind of devises and develops this hatred for Reed Richards. Now, that's kind of building on the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby origin from back in the day. As the years have gone on in Marvel Comics, more often than not, Dr. Doom's disdain of Reed Richards, and the reason why he made that video talking about everything that Reed Richards has gotten wrong and all that kind of stuff, I don't know why you gotta be so jealous, Dr. Doom, is that it really is just that, jealousy, right? It's nothing more than that, right? Dr. Doom is just jealous and petty over the fact that Reed Richards is better than he is. I'm talking to you straight out of Latveria. Here's a question for you. If you were so smart, Dr. Doom, why do you lose all the time? So the thing about this is that what he does, what he desires to do, right, kind of focusing back on this story here, is he desires to put himself in a situation where the influence of Mephisto can never reach him again. And by extension, he'll never feel any real longing or desire for another human being again. In essence, he's blocking the world away from him. That's why he creates his suit of armor, right? That's why he creates the mask and the whole 9 yards, and just starts referring to himself as Dr. Doom. And so following that, he ends up basically grabbing his guys and traveling to Latveria, which again, at this point, is now ruled by the Baron, who has essentially become its king. And he rules it with an iron fist, right? He treats his citizenry terribly. And you'll see how bad it is, right? Because things go sideways incredibly fast. The next thing he does is he takes up residence at a castle that not only overlooks some of the poorer people within Latveria, but actually overlooks the graves of all the children who had died when his mother had initially launched her campaign and Mephisto took them all out. And so as he plans all this, he looks around and he says, here, we would build the weapons we needed and gather the people around us, as I began to reshape Latveria with my own strong hands. And so what ends up happening is that while he's going on these small little campaigns and fighting, the king's men and allowing his legend to grow with each one of these little things, what he needs is for the world to grow faster, right? He needs his legend to grow much faster across Latveria, because it could take years for him to reach a point where the entirety of Latveria knows how powerful he is and sees him as someone who could legitimately challenge the king, but also someone that people could rally around. And so what he does is he goes back back to the roads that the Romani tribe used to take as they traveled around Latveria, and he finds Boris, an old friend of the family. And in fact, the guy who would go on to become his closest confidant. Like, if ever there were a friend, if Dr. Doom ever actually had a friend, it would be Boris, right? That would be the closest that you ever got to one. And so when he meets Boris and he greets him, that what Dr. Doom does is he has Boris call together the leaders of the Romani families who were all traveling together in this caravan. And he essentially tells them, right, like, I have power, I have technology, I can overthrow the king. We can finally cast him off and make him pay for all the things that we have done. There is one guy who challenges him. Dr. Doom kills this guy, and in order to kind of instill a little bit of fear in the people who serve him, that he makes them bury his corpse. It's not designed to say, like, I will become as evil as the king who rules you. It's basically to say that, like, I know what I'm doing. Do not challenge me. I am a man to be respected and feared. I am not a man to be trifled with. But at the end of the day, the difference between a king and somebody like Dr. Doom is that Dr. Doom loves his people, and he will care for his people in a way that the king never would. And again, we'll kind of see what that looks like. But what ends up happening is that the messengers, right, these members of the Romani tribe travel all through Latveria, taking the back roads, right, the routes that the soldiers of the king just either don't know about or wouldn't dare to take for fear of coming across these Romani tribes that would attack them and rob them because they're one or two soldiers by themselves. But word spreads fast, and ultimately it reaches Valeria, and Valeria comes back to see Dr. Doom. And notice the exchange between the two of them is very mechanical, and it's very, very cold. A lot of that's because of how he left her originally, but it's also because of how she sees him and the person that he's become. And so instead of greeting her with any kind of warmth, he's like, Valeria, what are you doing here, girl? Right? That kind of thing. You know, we prepare for war. This is no place for women. There's no warmth towards her, not the way there was when the two of them had recently come back into contact before he ultimately left her behind. And that's why she responds in a very cold way. Forgive me for disturbing you. I just had to see for myself what you'd become. And now that I have, I don't know what to make of it. This suit of armor is what you left me for. And he says, the armor is merely a shell, Valeria, and the man inside is not one that you would understand. Not anymore. And she calls it out right off the bat. She's like, it keeps your dreams away, doesn't it? The dreams of your mother. And so ultimately, he has her removed. And so what she says is like, you can't even look at me anymore. And you think that you have power now? You do not have power. All you've done is build better walls between yourself and the world. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? Like, the goal of Dr. Doom is to seize control of Latveria. And that's exactly what he does. That by going on these small skirmishes, right, with these little groups, these little pockets of resistance, each time he defeats the king's men, his legend grows. And these pockets of resistance start becoming groups of resistance, which becomes an army. So much so that it's just open rebellion. They start tearing down the statues of the king, all that kind of stuff, right? It all comes crashing down. There is a point where Dr. Doom speaks directly with the king, albeit through a hologram, and basically tells him, like, I'm the Victor Von Doom whose father you basically killed because he couldn't cure your wife. I'm the ghost of Christmas past, come to make your life a living hell. That's basically what it is, right? I'm the ghost of Christmas past, come to end your future, right? It's very, very poetic. And so he goes out and speaks to this massive army that he's basically built up here. And they launch a full campaign with what are now like very early versions or fairly advanced versions of essentially Doombots, right? There's only a few of them there, but between Dr. Doom's magical prowess, his technology, and his ability to basically inspire the soldiers that are fighting for him, the war is essentially over, right? And there's this really, really amazing moment where he's brought to these soldiers of the king who actually want to join his cause, because a lot of the king's soldiers feel the same way that Dr. Doom does, that the soldier has just made too many enemies. He's treated his men far too poorly for any of them to have any real loyalty. And so all the soldiers join his side except for one who's sent out to the king's side and to basically warn of the coming of Dr. Doom. And so when you switch over to the king and his captain, where in effect they realize that like the supply lines from Russia have been blown up, so there's no allies and no real reinforcements coming from the Soviet Union, that they're essentially on their own, that they can't win, right? They just cannot win this war. They're outnumbered, right? The entire country and its citizenry have turned against the king. There's nothing nothing he can do here. So he ends up calling forward a horse, and his sons essentially are sent out, which ultimately would be interesting because that's actually a major plot thread. And I think Christopher Cantwell's run on Doctor Doom, where they actually come back, or at least kind of start to kick off a sort of civil war, like a coup within Latveria, and basically driving its citizens to turn against Doctor Doom. But the bigger thing here is that what happens is that when Doctor Doom and his forces arrive here at the battlefield, that the soldiers don't attack, right? The orders given from the captain, right? Attack and kill the usurpers. They don't do anything, right? And literally Doctor Doom says this, right? He says, when the battle cry was sounded, neither side responded. They simply stood in place as if time had been stopped. And when the question is like, what are you waiting for? Tell them to attack. The response of the captain is, I am giving them that order, but they are not obeying. And the king figures out his own soldiers have turned against him. And Doom says, yes, the only movement on the battlefield was mine. The king's men had been delivered to me by the soldier I'd freed the day before. And when I strode toward them, they parted like tall grass before me, making way for their new ruler to pass. Doctor Doom travels through this city where even within the capital, its citizens are living in destitution and squalor, where the king himself lives a life of opulence. And Doctor Doom doesn't waste time. This guy goes up to where the king is, comes flying through, right? Just the stained glass, and just chokes him to death on the spot. There's no pomp and circumstance. There's no grandiose speech. That's it, right? He kills this guy and he's like, so it is done. And now a new age begins. And so like the captain bends the knee and Doctor Doom becomes the leader of Latveria. Now here's the crazy kicker. And this is what I was talking about when it came to the whole idea of Mephisto. That yes, Doctor Doom uses a combination of science and magic to basically improve the lives of the citizenry within Latveria. Because if there's any one thing that all of this has taught him, keep the people happy and you will stay in power. That's it. That's all it is, right? The one thing that every, harsh dictator fears is that the people will rise up against them. And so what happens is Boris and Doctor Doom go down into the basement. Doctor Doom basically kind of initiates an enchantment and he's met by the spiritual visage of Mephisto. And Mephisto is like, you've changed and you're wearing a suit of armor. I mean, it's not going to help you in the long run, but I will still kill you and take your soul when the time is right. And so Mephisto is just like, what do you want? Right? And Doctor Doom says, I wish you to free my mother's soul. And Mephisto's response is like, why would I do that, man? I love torturing and tormenting your mother, but I'll make you a deal. But I will make you a deal. I will let you come and rescue her or try to rescue her one night every year, right? One night every year you get that. But every time you lose, the people of your country will grow to despise you more and more. In just a few years' time, you will be the most hated man in Latveria. Then you will have her freedom, but she will still be beyond your grasp. For where her soul goes from here is a place that you will never enter, right? Basically the realm of Mistress Death. And he says, and so in a way, I will still win. And Doctor Doom says, I accept the deal. And the response of Mephisto is, there was never a doubt that you would, King Fool. Now here's the other part of this, right? If Doctor Doom were to die under any normal circumstance, then yeah, he would join his mom's soul in the afterlife. But when you make a deal with Mephisto, Mephisto takes your soul when you die. The only way to prevent that from happening is to either force Mephisto out as the ruler of hell, which has happened a couple times in Marvel Comics, or you kill him, which has never happened because Mephisto cannot actually be killed. He'll always reconstitute in hell, no matter how many times you destroy him. And so what you do is you switch over to Doom himself as he's giving this interview to this reporter. And this reporter's fascinated by it, right? She was like, okay, like this has been so cool. I really appreciate you granting me this interview. She was like, but there is one question that I have, or one thing that I have if you'll allow it. It would be a really, really cool thing if I could get a look under your mask. Boris said that you'd cooperate if I mentioned Valeria. And so Dr. Doom responds and says, Valeria, very well. But know that what you are about to see has been hidden from the world for decades. And though I care not for the flesh of existence any longer, I warn you, it is not an easy sight to behold. Only for us to find out it's a Doombot. It's not actually Dr. Doom. And so the reporter's just kind of like, okay, thank you, right? This has all been quite informative, and she goes to leave. But as she leaves, she's talking to Boris, and she asks the question, right? Like, is Valeria this Doombot's failsafe word? And the response of Boris is yes, in a way. And she's like, and this Doombot, right? It really believes it's the real Victor Von Doom? And the response of Boris is he does, right? He even ruled for a time when the master was otherwise engaged. And that's where she asks, but like those memories, can they be relied upon? And the response of Victor is yes. They are Dr. Doom's own words programmed into the machine that he built to stand in his place. And so as they're making their way through here, she says, I don't know how to thank you for this. The access to all these prisoners, it's been illuminating to say the least. Their view of Doom, along with his own words, this is the story of a lifetime. And Boris says, yes, I'm sure it would be if you were ever allowed to tell it. And that's when he slams the door and just says, like, you're a prisoner here now, right? The agreement was that you would be allowed to come down here to learn his secrets, but you were never told you'd be allowed to leave. So this woman will spend the rest of her life in a prison cell down in Castle Doom with the greatest story that will never get told. But I'm telling it now. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments. It's a phenomenal story, and I will catch you all later. Peace.